On November 13, 2020, commanders from the United States and Moroccan militaries met to plan annual joint exercises. The following day, 1,000 Moroccan soldiers and 200 vehicles stormed into the Gujarat border crossing, a key highway in the occupied Western Sahara that connects Morocco to Mauritania, built in violation of international law. The indigenous people, known as Sahrawis, had been staging daily protests in this demilitarized zone and blocking the road for 3 weeks prior. Though no one was injured in Morocco's attack, it shattered a 29-year ceasefire and reignited an independence struggle in Africa's last colony, the Western Sahara.
We are determined to use all legitimate means to end the occupation of parts of our territory. Despite the support, the political and material support that Morocco is having from other parties in the world.
After the Moroccan attack, the Sahrawi armed resistance group, known as the POLISARIO Front, evacuated the civilian protesters and returned fire. Since then, Sahrawi men and women enlisted in the resistance group have battled Moroccan forces using aging weaponry from the Soviet Union. The Moroccan military doesn't allow journalists to enter the occupied territory, creating a media blackout. The POLISARIO Front has provided these videos of their military operations, but there is no information about casualties, and family members of fighters have no way to contact them.
I don't know if my brothers are still alive. I don't know if my family that lived there are alive, because we don't have that information. We don't have any contact.
As the battle raged, then President Donald Trump announced US recognition of Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara, and that Morocco would follow the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and formally normalize relations with Israel. At the center of this effort was Jared Kushner.
By recognizing Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara, President Trump is rejecting the failed status quo, which benefits no one, and instead is driving toward a just, lasting, and mutually acceptable solution.
But this mutual recognition of occupying states with expansionist ideologies is little more than the rebranding of a long-existing status quo. The territory of the Western Sahara is the last settler colony in Africa. 80% of the territory is under Moroccan occupation, and settlers now constitute 2/3 of the population of 500,000. The Sahrawi struggle for independence predates Moroccan occupation. In 1884, Spain began to colonize the Western Sahara, referring to it as the Spanish Sahara and its inhabitants as the Sahrawis. From 1957 to 1958, the Sahrawis began an uprising against Spain that formed a national consciousness. This was backed by international law. In 1972, UN Resolution 2983 reassured the inalienable right of the people of the Sahara to self-determination and independence. In the early 1970s, Sahrawi El-Awli Mustafa Sayed, influenced by the revolutionary writer Frantz Fanon, founded the POLISARIO Front, an armed resistance group dedicated to ousting the US-backed fascist dictator of Spain, Francisco Franco. But Hassan II, the King of Morocco, which had gained independence from France and Spain in the 1950s, was weakened after 2 failed military coups d'etats. To bolster his nationalist credentials, Hassan looked to expand borders south as part of a greater Morocco vision, setting up for a clash with Spain and international rulings. In 1975, the United Nations Security Council issued a report in favor of Sahrawi independence, and the International Court of Justice issued an opinion against Moroccan and Mauritanian claims to the territory, signifying its status as the last colony of Africa. Franco was on his deathbed and worried that a renewed colonial war in Africa would undermine his regime's stability. For Washington, Morocco was an important Cold War ally, essential to projecting anti-communist influence over the Mediterranean, Africa, and into Southwest Asia. Former US Ambassador to Morocco, Joseph Werner Reed Jr. remarked, "It is obvious that the next pressure point for the Soviets is going to be the Kingdom of Morocco, situated strategically as it is on the Straits of Gibraltar." Washington secretly arranged for the Spanish to withdraw from the Western Sahara and cede it to Morocco and Mauritania. The United States and Saudi Arabia helped Morocco plan what is known as the Green March. King Hassan ordered 350,000 volunteers, flanked by military forces, to storm the Western Sahara, portraying an armed invasion as an act of liberation.
لنلتحق بالصحراء ولنصل الرحم مع إخواننا في الصحراء.
The marchers carried Qurans, Moroccans, and Saudi flags. Moroccan soldiers acted with unrestrained brutality as they carried out a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Witnesses described widespread torture, rape, and murder. 40,000 Sahrawi civilians fled to the interior of the territory. There they were attacked by Moroccan warplanes that fired napalm and white phosphorus. Others fled to safety in neighboring Algeria, where they built refugee camps. Defiant, Al-Ali Mustafa Sayyid and the Sahrawis declared the independence of the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic.
Bismillah, وبعون من الله وتجسيدا لإرادة الشعب العربي ووفاء لشهدائنا الأبرار وتتويجا لتضحيات شعبنا سيرتفع اليوم على أرض الساقية الحمراء ووادي الذهب علم الجمهورية العربية الصحراوية الديمقراطية.
The POLISARIO front continued to battle the much larger militaries of Morocco and Mauritania, winning impressive successes. By 1979, Mauritania was forced into an agreement and withdrew. The POLISARIO, backed by Muammar Gaddafi's Libya and Abdelaziz Bouteflika's Algeria, continued to battle US and EU-backed Moroccan forces. While Israel and Morocco developed ties in secret and the Mossad helped stamp out Moroccan opposition movements, Palestinian revolutionary leader George Habash visited the Sahrawi refugees to declare support for their cause.
عندما تمت اتفاقية كامب ديفيد بين النظام المصري العنيل والكيان الصهيوني ارتفع صوت الحسن الثاني الخائن ليقول بأن تحالف العرب مع التكنولوجيا الصهيونية هي التي ستجعل من هذه المنطقة جنة، أي أن الحسن الثاني الخائن هو أول من دعا إلى تحالف الرجعيين العرب مع الكيان الصهيوني.
In 1981, Morocco began construction of a 1,600-mile wall, the longest military barrier in the world, made of sand, loaded with sensors supplied by the US and France, booby-trapped with millions of mines, and patrolled by tens of thousands of soldiers. This would prevent the return of Sahrawi refugees and cement Moroccan control of the majority of the territory. In the wake of the Iranian Revolution that ousted the US-backed Shah, the Carter and Reagan administrations increased economic and military aid to prop up the Kingdom of Morocco, which was facing an internal crisis from importing food and energy, a drought, and its expensive occupation. The two countries signed an agreement allowing the US to use its military air bases. Washington saw this as a crucial step in projecting its influence. In 1991, a United Nations peacekeeping mission brokered a ceasefire that was to be followed with a referendum whether to join Morocco or to become independent. But Moroccan intransigence and UN malfeasance prevented the referendum from ever taking place. Over the decades, the Moroccan settler population expanded, and the United States and European Union have illegally exploited the Western Sahara's resources, mining phosphates, fishing in its waters, and in recent years drilling for oil and gas. Phosphates are an essential ingredient in fertilizers for growing crops and agribusiness that has a major impact on US policy. One analysis states that US phosphate supplies will run out within the next 4 decades, but Morocco has a supply of at least 300 years, adding that the issue has the potential to alter current appraisals of American strategic interests in the region. Perhaps even more valuable in the short term than Western Sahara's mineral deposits is the fish in its coastal waters, but unregulated Moroccan and European fishing have depleted stocks. An independent study commissioned by the European Union in 2011 found that Western Sahara's fish supply had been decimated. While Sahrawi refugees are forced to rely on pittances from the European Union, Morocco illegally sells their fish resources to foreign countries. Western Sahara Resource Watch found that the value of the exports of fish meal from the occupied territory to Turkey alone equals 3 times the entire amount that is donated in multilateral aid to the refugees in 1 year. And the EU today pays Morocco more to get access to Western Sahara's fish banks than they give in aid to the refugees. What's more, a document from the Moroccan Foreign Ministry leaked in 2014 revealed that Morocco strategically embroils other countries in its occupation in order to shield it from international law. The document called to implicate Russia in activities in the Sahara, as is already the case in the field of fisheries. In return, Russia could guarantee a freeze on the Sahara file within the UN. Indeed, the UN has stalled out time and time again in delivering any semblance of justice for the people of the Western Sahara. Nearly 50 years after its occupation of the Western Sahara began, Morocco remains a key outpost of Western imperialism in Africa. It's a major non-NATO ally and hosts the African Lion and Phoenix Express exercises with the US military. Morocco is also a major recipient of American weapons. 91% of its arms imports are from the United States, and in 2019, Morocco spent $10.3 billion on US weapons, more than any other country in Africa or the Middle East, and signed a 10-year military cooperation agreement with the Trump administration. In some regards, Morocco's occupation of the Western Sahara is a project of the United States. Moroccan military officers study at the U.S. Army War College and National Defense University in its International Military Education and Training Program. The majority of these officers are deployed to the Western Sahara upon graduation, where they oversee an occupation regime dedicated to stamping out the Sahrawi national cause. Protests are met with brutal force and severe beatings. Morocco is also a partner in the secretive US-led Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership. Yet its political, social, and economic dynamic produces a disproportionate number of jihadists that have fought in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Chechnya, and Syria, and carried out a series of bombings in Madrid in 2004. The same geopolitical dynamic from the Cold War exists today. Morocco's militarization has sparked an arms race for dominance of the skies with neighboring Algeria, which has been a longtime supporter of the POLISARIO and hosts Sahrawi refugees. In May 2020, Algeria agreed to purchase Russian weapons, cementing its status as the continent's top importer of Russian military equipment. For Sahrawis, decades of Moroccan occupation and empty promises from the international community have bred frustration and militancy, and the COVID-19 pandemic has made life in the refugee camps even more unbearable. As for what the Biden administration might do, his Secretary of Defense was clueless when he was asked his opinion on the Western Sahara.
Well, that's an issue that I certainly would want to take a closer look at, Mr. Chairman, before I gave you a detailed answer. But it's one of the things that I'll look at, if confirmed, right away going into the position.
With little information coming out of the battle between Moroccan occupation forces and the Polisario Front, only time will tell whether the Sahrawi struggle for independence will succeed and if Morocco's refusal to end its rule will spark a wider war.